In the heart of Paris, amid the Black Death of 1348, Europe's most populous urban center, crowded with 200,000 inhabitants within its ancient fortifications, begins to unravel. This collapse unfolds not gradually via blockade or starvation, but at a horrifying pace. Whole households vanish in a single night. Corpses accumulate in the roadways quicker than wagons can haul them away. The relentless clang of Notre Dame's death knell echoes ceaselessly, day and night, as the metropolis loses track of its mounting losses. Over the next 6 months, half its residents will perish. Yet the fatality count tells just part of the tale. What renders the Black Death in Paris so ruinous is its assault on the very foundations of communal existence. Mothers and fathers desert their offspring. Clergy abandon their flocks. Residents dodge one another on the sidewalks. Even the simplest gesture of affection, reaching out to comfort the ill, turns into a fatal risk. The epidemic eradicates not only lives but faith in others, empathy, and the connections essential to city dwelling. Paris, in 1348, represents the zenith of medieval splendor, abruptly warped into a lethal snare. Thoroughfares reek of decaying bodies, while river barges for grain are converted into drifting coffins. Communal burial pits prove insufficient to match the rate of fatalities. In this environment, the inevitable query shifts from if you'll grieve a loved one to whether you'll stand by them in their final moments. This narrative captures that fateful summer, the season when cradling a stricken youngster pitted devotion against self-preservation. It was the era when Europe's premier metropolis learned how precariously society hangs by a thread. At the dawn of 1348, Paris embodied the pinnacle of medieval progress. As the continent's biggest settlement, it sheltered 200,000 souls. Notre Dame had risen to completion mere decades before, its spires dominating the skyline over the Ile de la Cité as emblems of boundless civic aspiration. The University of Paris attracted intellectuals from every corner of Christendom. The markets of Les Halles teemed with traders hawking Eastern spices, Flemish wool, and Burgundian vintages. Though the 100 Years' War had ignited 10 years prior, the capital escaped the brunt of hostilities. Its boundaries pushed outward past the historic ramparts into burgeoning neighborhoods. This remained the golden age of grand churches, a period of booming populations and thriving commerce. But such affluence sowed the seeds of peril. The capital's lanes formed tight, shadowed tunnels of wood and stucco. Certain alleys spanned no more than 6 meters across, and some narrowed to under a meter. Dwellings climbed 3, 4, even 5 levels high, tilting toward each other so that rooftops almost met overhead, depriving the stones beneath of any daylight. Households crammed into one chamber per family. Beds served several occupants. The atmosphere hung heavy and moist. Sanitation systems were non-existent. Excrement and vendor trash festered in gutters slicing through the middle of every road. Rodents infested basements, back streets, and heaps of refuse alike. Urban expansion had outstripped any supporting framework. Even the affluent grappled with inadequate diets. Life expectancy averaged just 18 years, accounting for high rates of infant and juvenile deaths. Illnesses raged perennially. Dysentery, consumption, dermal ailments. The populace had normalized mortality as an everyday companion. They couldn't foresee the horror ahead. The very crowding that fueled Paris's wealth, teeming bazaars, jammed lodgings, ceaseless traffic of folks and freight, would shortly turn it into an incubator for doom. All the strengths the city had amassed flipped into fatal weaknesses. When fleas bearing the plague infiltrated in June 1348, they encountered prime habitat, a rodent-plagued sprawl where people coexisted intimately, their defenses compromised by frailty and ignorance of cleanliness or microbial transmission. The groundwork for calamity was firmly set. Paris teetered on the brink of self-annihilation. That June in Russie, a short distance north of the capital, initial outbreaks surfaced in hamlets around Gonesse. Rural workers fell prey to abrupt high temperatures. Agonizing bulges swelled in their armpits and groins. In mere days they succumbed. The scourge had slithered through Europe for months, propelled along commercial paths from southern harbors. Now it lapped at the fringes of the mainland's grandest hub. Come August, it stormed the gates. The affliction manifested in three variants, each grimmer than the previous. The bubonic strain caused inflamed, darkened glands, the infamous buboes, lending it its title. These repulsive growths ballooned to egg size, seeping crimson and discharge. Demise followed swiftly, claiming 40% of sufferers. Pneumonic plague targeted the respiratory system. Patients hacked up gore, gasped for air, and propagated contagion via each ragged breath. This variant wiped out almost all victims in under 3 days. Septicemic plague invaded the veins outright. Sufferers endured savage migraines, feverish ravings, bloody heaves, and then oblivion, often mere hours after onset. The velocity of it all left everyone stunned. An individual might rise in the morning feeling perfectly fine, only to spike a fever by midday and perish before dawn the following day. Jean Dionnet, a friar who documented the outbreak, put it bluntly. The healthy man of yesterday lay dead today, carted off to his burial. No chance to ready oneself, no moment to grasp the horror unfolding. Households retired whole and rose to discover loved ones gasping their last. Homes brimming with vitality moments ago lay deserted in mere days. Come November, the epidemic hit its zenith, claiming 800 lives each day just in Paris. In the neighboring area of Saint-Denis, officials tallied 16,000 corpses. Mortality in the Sanja-Luzero parish surged 50-fold beyond typical rates. The authorities quit logging every fatality. There were far too many to track. The death knell from Notam pealed ceaselessly. Tradition held that church bells must toll for each Paris death to alert the officials. In ordinary times, this meant a handful of chimes daily, a somber nod to the ever-present but bounded specter of mortality. But now the resonant bronze clamor reverberated non-stop through day and night. Procession after procession of funerals merged the tolls into an unending lament, the grim auditory backdrop to the city's collapse. Jean de Venette described it as an intensely funereal mood, though words fell short of conveying the mental burden. That relentless ringing forbade any lapse in awareness, any illusion of normalcy, any flight from the truth that your surroundings were crumbling into oblivion. In time, officials silenced the bells, not from reverence, but sheer futility. The deceased overwhelmed the survivors' ability to mark their passing. Carts soon rolled in to haul away the bodies. With 500 corpses daily hauled from the Hotel Dieu Hospital and residences alike, these wooden vehicles lumbered along the streets, axles groaning over the uneven stones. They halted at plague-flagged dwellings, where remains were dumped atop the heaps, some still bearing faint warmth, others long cold, swollen, and starting to putrefy. The vessels that once ferried bread from Corbeil were commandeered as makeshift barges of the dead, gliding down the Seine, freighted with cadavers rather than provisions, heading to interment sites beyond the ramparts. Locals dubbed them corbillards, a term that endured and still denotes a hearse in French. Paris's everyday clamor evaporated entirely. The familiar bustle, vendors hawking wares, hammers on scaffolds, rumbling wagon wheels, youngsters at play, faded away. What lingered instead were the death wagon's persistent squeals, the unceasing bell tones and sporadic wails piercing from infected abodes. Never had quiet weighed so oppressively. The Chimaya Deos cemetery adjacent to Leal embodied the disaster in stark form. This venerable burial ground had tended the city for ages, yet now it faltered under the load. Vast communal trenches were excavated, each devouring 1,500 forms. Once a pit brimmed, soil was shoveled over it, and another gash opened nearby. The earth grew sodden with decaying matter, the dirt darkening to a greasy hue. A mere drizzle would unearth the remains under the scant covering, skeletons thrusting through the sludge like a grotesque harvest. Laborers at the site couldn't excavate swiftly enough. Corpses accumulated in stacks. The reek proved intolerable, putrid flesh blended with a cloying, fetid sweetness. Residents fled their nearby properties. Neither scents nor smoldering herbs could blunt the odor. Numerous Grand Paris residences now sat vacant, not solely from owners' demise, but because the very atmosphere turned suffocating. Buildings decayed untended, entrances ajar, treasures left exposed within. None ventured inside. The scourge carved Paris into realms of lethality. The Hôtel d'Ur hospital, strained even prior to the pestilence with shared bedding and a 20% fatality rate, devolved into a chamber of horrors. Death rates exploded. Cadavers cluttered the corridors. The nursing sisters pressed on amid the onslaught, which thinned their numbers repeatedly, demanding fresh recruits as losses mounted. Thoroughfares turned treacherous. The tight lanes that had funneled trade now bottled up the illness. In alleys scarcely wider than 60 centimeters, steering clear of the afflicted proved impossible. The moribund staggered through byways, hacking up blood and smearing contagion on whatever they brushed. Stalls at Les Halles markets lay all but barren. River traffic served the dead now. Traders had escaped or succumbed. Survivors cowered, unwilling to barter. The metropolis morphed into a labyrinth of peril, devoid of secure routes. The pestilence laid bare an inescapable fact that all dreaded admitting. Infection spread palpably. Though medieval folk grasped neither microbes nor transmission paths, the evidence stared them down. Tending the ill led to your end. Contact, handling remains, or inhaling a tainted room's vapors seldom spared you. Such insight forced the most heartless reckoning possible. Parents deserted their offspring. Spouses deserted their partners. One sibling forsook another to perish in isolation. Jean Dionnet recorded that __quote_1__, not enough survivors to enter the deceased, had rung all too true. Rebuilding now fell to a remnant labor force, bereft of most prior expertise and guidance. The crisis that followed unleashed fiscal ruin. Scant hands available to reap the fields, staff the forges, or sustain the bazaars. Costs soared wildly. Soaring prices crushed the lingering residents. Then, an unforeseen shift occurred. The dire scarcity of workers handed leverage to the toilers such as they had never known. Nobles and traders, frantic to till the lands and man the enterprises, were compelled to grant elevated pay and improved terms. The inflexible hierarchies of feudal life began to fracture. It would require 200 years for Paris to restore its numbers from before the calamity. The nation of France would not rebound until 4.5 centuries later, not until the French Revolution. The scars on the psyche cut even deeper. Chronicler Jean de Venette observed how those who lived wed hastily and bore numerous offspring. Yet this burst of new life did not herald improvement. Instead, it worsened the human condition as folks grew more rapacious and acquisitive than ever, more envious, prone to constant clashes through lawsuits, quarrels, and wrangling. The epidemic had laid bare an unerasable truth about mankind. Confronted by calamity, the majority opted for their own skin over empathy. The ties binding communities proved far more brittle than supposed. mothers forsaking their young, clerics deserting their flocks, acquaintances shunning one another on sight. They made it through, but bore the weight of their deeds in memory. A whole cohort carried the burden of knowing that, when put to the test, they had faltered. Paris rose anew. Pathways were swept clean, abodes mended, stalls revived, and urban life pulsed once more. Yet it was no longer the familiar place. The buoyant hopes of the early 1300s, the conviction that advancement and abundance were assured, had perished alongside the afflicted. In their stead arose a tougher, more jaded outlook, keenly conscious of how swiftly order could dissolve. The Black Death imparted to Paris a stark lesson: that societal order is but a fragile gloss atop anarchy, that affection has boundaries, that amid threats to existence, most will prioritize self over solidarity. The sisters at Hôtel Dieu, who recommitted themselves repeatedly, even as the illness claimed them, demonstrated that human decency could endure amid inferno, but such were the rarities. The bulk of the city's dwellers drew a harsher conclusion: that they possessed the capacity for desertion, that terror could sever familial and obligatory links, that disaster's true horror lies not in the havoc wrought upon the streets, but in the shadows it casts upon the soul. Paris persevered. The urban heart beat on. Yet a vital essence had vanished, a trust in humanity's inherent virtue and the world's enduring order. That void proved irretrievable. The pestilence faded. Mortality ceased. Daily existence recommenced. But every soul who weathered that fateful summer grasped the reality. When forced to choose between clinging to a cherished one or securing one's own fate, the greater number selected endurance. And they bore that decision through all their remaining days.